Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning, we're going to talk about Anatta and LGBTQIA plus identities, inspired by the work that our friends at Rainbody have done. So this is a nice little pamphlet that is called Welcoming the Rainbow, a guide to LGBTQIA plus inclusion for Buddhists. And it's been made by our friends in Australia, spearheaded by Bante Akaliko. And you can go to rainbody.org. Let me put it right here. And you can find more information on the beautiful work that they're doing. So this little project inspired a little bit the talk for this morning, that it's a very important talk because it actually very much impacts, well, first our understanding as Buddhists, and also the how we're supposed to relate to so many different people that are practicing together with us, or how to relate to ourselves if we hold one of the LGBTQIA plus identities. And so it's quite interesting when one sees the texts. Going back always here at Empty Cloud, we have a big emphasis on the suttas. We have a big emphasis on the early Buddhist texts, and sometimes what we see in the texts or the approach in the text is not necessarily what we see, what we encounter, what kind of experiences we have when we go to either temples, monasteries, or meditation centers, or wherever we are with our practitioners. But before I actually continue, I would like to pay homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. So yes, as we were saying, sometimes what we find in different places where we formally take refuge can be a little bit in dissonance with our expectations, or perhaps also our understanding of the teachings of the Buddha. And sometimes it can be upsetting, and sometimes it can be actually a great source of conditions in order for us to investigate the Dhamma, to see if actually we have understood it correctly or we have not understood it correctly, or to see why different groups of people might hold different views. So we see also in different Buddhist countries, there can be actually a lot of, when it comes to LGBTQIA plus identifying people, there can be a lot of unfortunately laws. Actually, if one goes in Sri Lanka, currently same-sex relationships are persecuted legally, as well as in Burma, and one can assume that, given that these laws are present in countries that are predominantly Buddhist, that these are a reflection of Buddhism. They're a reflection of the religion and the morality that is ascribed to the religion. Or one goes to Thailand, though, and actually there is not the same sort of situation that one can encounter both in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka. So clearly there is something perhaps a little bit different there. Is it an interpretation of the text? Is it an interpretation of morality, or is it has to do with something else? Well, when one delves deeply actually into the history of of Buddhism, or actually even superficially, to be quite frank, really just a a little Google search and a Wikipedia search is sufficient actually to cover precisely this subject matter. One sees that, for example, these laws, both in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka, are actually quite relatively recent. They're, if I remember correctly, were instated in at the end of the 19th century, and they were the product of colonization. So there is actually, in fact, um, a religious sort of moral implication in these laws, but it does not come from Buddhism, but actually it comes um, the from Abrahamic ideas of what is appropriate sexual conduct. As a matter of fact, when one sees the history of Sri Lanka, actually, up until the colonization of the island, same-sex relationships were actually completely a non-issue. And when one sees the text, the original text, there's actually very little about LGBTQIA plus identities and also relationships. And when there is, it's just spoken about matter of factly. It's never an issue. And it's kind of interesting because also in the texts, there's also very little, if anything at all, on racism. Why is that so? Because it was a non-issue. So it's quite interesting, when one reads, for example, the Vinaya, there are several different ways through which the sexual activity of monastics is regulated, and different ways through which the monastics are said to have been done, to have broken the precepts. And so, of course, in the Parajika rules, the main rules that we can't break when we take monastic vows, both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, they are precepts that actually essentially are about not breaking celibacy. And of course, in the nuts and bolts, there is all the different ways through which monastics can breach their vow of celibacy. And all the ways that are listed, some are entail heterosexual sex, and some entail same-sex sex. And there's nothing, once again, nothing that makes the latter any different than the former, but rather it's stated matter-of-factly that it's an infraction. We see, of course, throughout the suttas, these days there's a lot of actually conversations, definitely in the United States, but I think worldwide, but in particular in the Western world, in terms of the separation of gender and sex, and how biological sex not necessarily is equivalent to gender, and that gender is usually assigned at birth, and some people identify with the gender that they're assigned at birth, and some people do not. And we think that we are very, very, very progressive, but actually, when we look at the suttas, most often than not, actually, that's how these words like male and female are used. They're rarely actually a description they're rarely connected to a description of precise physical attributes, but rather, for example, in the Samyoga Sutta, that is usually used sometimes as an example of the gender binary in the suttas. Well, actually, as a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. I gave actually a while back, I think a couple of years ago, a sutta study precisely on the Samyoga Sutta, where we analyze it in depth. And actually, we see that in that sutta, the Buddha explains to us how the process of gender identification comes into being. And he uses two frameworks, the gender identification as a female and a gender identification as a male, But what is really incredible in that sutta is that there is never, never, never a qualification in terms of physical bodily attributes, but rather all about that sutta is focused on mental constructs of gender identification and how we cling to it. And in that way, we can't transcend them. So it's quite interesting because actually, when we think about transcending and when we think about gender, transgender seems actually something that maybe we all need to aspire to, if not physically, definitely mentally. But we'll get to that in a short while. Another thing that I wanted to share with you this morning is also in terms of different stories that are presented in the Vinaya, of course, of the famous story of the bhikkhu being born the next day as a female and shifting from the bhikkhu sangha to the bhikkhuni sangha, and the Buddha inviting once again if there was a shift in from female to male attributes to naturally, no problem, shift to the other sort of part of the other sangha. And also, there's also an amusing story actually of this is part of the commentaries in the Theragatha, where actually one of the Theras, one of the enlightened men the time of the Buddha, is said to be the Brahman Vakali. He was said to like the story of how he got into Buddhism was by seeing the Buddha and being so in love with how good looking the Buddha was. And so the Brahman Vakali essentially decided to follow the Buddha around everywhere, pretty much stalk him, essentially. He was staring at him all the time. And at a certain point, the Buddha had to literally address the situation with him and go like, why are you so obsessed with my body? This is, it's just a bunch of putrid flesh. So essentially inviting him to practice asubha. And eventually then the Brahman Vakali decided to understood the teachings of the Buddha and decided to join the Sangha and became fully enlightened. So it's quite amazing how there was never any problem in that episode, for example, even in the commentaries that are known to be sort of later than of the time of the Buddha, but in their description of the accounts, it seems to be once again a non-problem. So this all comes back then to what is a problem in Buddhism when we talk about sexuality. Most often than not, usually what we describe as sexual misconduct is not necessarily what is sexual misconduct or how it's defined by the Buddha, but rather what we think it is based on so many different causes and conditions, based on our tradition, based on our culture, based on our views, perhaps, on what is correct, what is appropriate, and what is inappropriate. And all of these, of course, have to do with also history of where, the history that we were talking about earlier. So many different inferences. Today's culture is not just one single thing that has been, permanently there in any place for such a long period of time, but rather, as with every single condition phenomena, is dependently arisen. And so it's in constant change. So there are so many different influences that when we talk about today's Buddhist cultures, well, they're not necessarily just Buddhist, but rather they might be Buddhist with a touch of Christianity and with a touch of Islam and with a touch of Confucianism and with a touch of Brahmanism and so forth. So it's very important to kind of really understand what is the Buddha's message and how does that work within the framework of the Dhamma, so that we can see what we think. We can look at what we think of what is sexual misconduct, what is good sexual conduct, and actually kind of peel it up like it was an onion, and understand what is, the Buddhist message and what is not. And from my understanding of, from my doing the work that I've been doing here, is that the Buddha never, ever in the suttas mentions, for example, or invites us to do, well, he never invites us to have sex to begin with, but not because it's a sex negative religion, but rather, of course, as monastics, we are encouraged to look at desire. We're encouraged to investigate desire, and we're encouraged then to, by looking deeply with insight at desire, to transcend desire. And with lay people, of course, who do not take celibacy vows, the encouragement is to not harm others. But there is no place in the suttas where the Buddha, for example, says that sex is something that can only be done in a married, for example, relationship, where two people need to be married, or even 3 people, 4 people, 5 people. There is no, for example, monogamy that is encouraged in the suttas. There's also no polyamory encouraged either, but it's just matter of factly there, taken into consideration as something that could happen. And the important thing is that everybody in the relationship is not harmed. So essentially, we see that it all comes back to that value of Dhamma, of ahimsa, of non-harming. So that is the point. That is what we're trying to develop in our Buddhist practice. It's not, we're not trying to establish a family with lots of different children. We're not trying to fit into society. We're not trying to create as many Buddhists as possible in the world, but rather what we're trying to do is to practice towards the cessation of suffering. And that means that we don't want to harm others through the means of our sexuality. So when we see sexuality in this context, then obviously it doesn't matter who is our partner or whether we can biologically have children with that partner, but rather the important thing is who is not being harmed in the relationship. And I want to encourage each one of you, if you have any questions, to write them down at any time, and we can address it as we go, because I see that there are already like a lot of different friends. Hi to Rick, John, Michael, Chittapala, Shimul, etc. Michael says, Ayya, does the Vinaya contain rules that affect non-cis binary monks, Buddhist practitioners? And if so, this opens a discussion about major and minor precepts and whether and how we abandon the latter when they are no longer applicable. Yes, I would say that absolutely. I think I addressed that straight away in the talk, where, yeah, it's just essentially spoken matter-of-factly, and yeah, of course, it's very much contemplated the way that we use our sexuality as monastics. So if you have a follow-up question, you're welcome to put it up. And Robert says, it feels as though the modern gender movement has an extreme emphasis on self-identification. There are labels for everything. This seems to contradict the Buddhist teachings. Your views? So this is actually a very good question, that, in fact, is actually the topic of today that we haven't addressed yet. So I'm glad that you asked this, which is anatta. And I want to quote actually Dogen quote that says, "To study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by all things." I think in a nutshell, this addresses essentially the question that you're asking in a way that the emphasis on self-identification, I wouldn't say that is necessarily a bad thing, but actually it's an instrument, it's a means to an end. In Tibetan Buddhism, actually, the Mahamudra practices are all about that, are all about essentially shedding light to how we identify ourselves, with how we identify the mind, for example. So some of the questions that we're invited to ask ourselves in insight meditation is, for example, is the mind inside of me or outside of me? What color is the mind? What shape is the mind? And so forth. So you can say that maybe Mahamudra has an extreme emphasis on mind self-identification. And yeah, that is a process through which we understand ourselves. We understand how we identify. How can you transcend something that you don't know what it is? You know, if, for example, there are weeds in the garden and you want to get rid of the weeds, well, you have to first understand what weeds look like and also what plants look like. What are the fruits? What are the ones that we don't call weeds? What are the ones that we want to keep there? So yes, this is a process of analysis that I think that actually the emphasis on self-identification is something very important. It's a mm, it's a way, it's a tool through which we are empowered to investigate something very subtle, very very nuanced as well. So I wouldn't say it contradicts the Buddha's teachings, quite the opposite. The teachings of the Buddha do empower us to see, to understand what is our conditioning right now. So to have names for things, it's actually very important. Getting back to the Samyoga Sutta, that is all about, once again, has an extreme emphasis on self-identification, to use again your words. And of course, the ultimate, essentially the purpose of all of that is to transcend all of our identities. But this is regardless whether we identify as cishet, if we identify as non-binary, or we identify as gay, lesbian, intersex, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. If we identify as queer, it doesn't matter the gender identification. Of course, we need to throw it all out, but we need to know what we are transcending in order to transcend it. Otherwise, it still stays there. And so actually, I would say that I find personally, when I was actually a lay person, I used to be a journalist, and I had done a reportage with a friend where we interviewed a lot of different people who were trans men, so who had transitioned from having a female body assigned at birth, and they wanted to match their gender identification. So they started transitioning to a male body. And I remember in particular this person, this friend who he was born as a African American female, and when he was talking to me, he was now a trans man, an African American trans man, and he was talking about his experience of how different it was, the shift of how different it was, his experience of reality, now that he had matched his gender identity. But there was also a lot of different surprising factors. So, for example, that all of a sudden he was finding that a lot of women around him were threatened by him. And that was something that was really new to his experience, because he had not had that with that previous sort of mm, previous body, previous way through which people were relating to him. But also, people were more prone to listening to him, would take with more seriousness um, what he had to say, or with more weight what he had to say, and so forth. So there were lots of different things that had shifted, that I think, even though, when we had that conversation, neither of us were Buddhists, neither of us had the Dharma to use as a framework to investigate our experience. But both of us were actually having this really incredible conversation on how essentially our experience is dependently arisen, and the body that we manifest in the world definitely has a lot of repercussions on our experience of the world. So I would say that actually, for example, a transgender experience, when one has the support of the Dhamma, then can be an incredible way to actually transcend gender, to actually really see the three characteristics. It empowers. I think transgender people are extremely empowered to really look at the three characteristics of dukkha, anicca, and anatta in a way that sometimes for other folks, it can be something a little bit perhaps too subtle, a bit too much. We can take it so much for granted, right? That this is our experience, and there is no other experience other than ours. And that, nobody questions it, especially if someone is comfortable with the gender that they've been assigned at birth. Well, it's very hard to even think that it's a problem. It's even very hard to question what that even means, what it means to be a male or a woman. Sorry, a male or a female, or a man or a woman, and so forth. But these are all things that, regardless of our gender identities, we need to investigate. And Robert says, the Soma Sutta seems to say that we should not cling to our gender, but the modern transgender movement has such a massive emphasis on gender and gender identity. How do we reconcile these facts? So I would say that actually it's not true that the Soma Sutta doesn't say that we should not cling to our gender, but rather it says that has nothing to do with our capacity, that gender has nothing to do with our capacity to do the work of Dhamma. And of course, if we cling to I'm a woman, I'm a man, or I'm anything at all, then we create the conditions for Mara to address us. But this, once again, we're talking about ultimate reality. So we're talking about, of course, the practice of Dhamma, and the realization of Dhamma. So the realization of Dhamma, once again, we said that it's completely devoid of gender identities, but the practice of Dhamma involves understanding different gender identities. And Anagarika Sarana says, do you think ordination for transgender people will be available one day? Which do you think are the obstacles for that to occur in the future? I am very optimistic. I think that absolutely. And I suspect actually they already are available. It's just that they're not probably advertised in the way that we expect them to be advertised, definitely in the Western world. And the obstacles is just our ignorance. All of our ignorance as unenlightened disciples of the Buddha. It's actually very interesting because, for example, in the ordination procedures, there's only, like in the bhikkhu ordination procedures, there's only asked, are you a man? So why are we inferring a definition to are you a man? It's actually like I think the questions are more interesting than the statements. So once again, it's a Mahamudra out there. What is actually a man? What is actually a woman? All of that um, is not just some present, once again, not some mm, conversation that we're having right now in the West, but it's something that has always been, an interesting question everywhere in every single culture. And there's so many different ways through to navigate all of this because, once again, it's not set in stone. The definition of being, once again, a woman is very different in the United States than it is in Italy, than it is in Thailand. There's also different people that present in different ways that can be taken for one gender or the other. So, how do we define who is what and what is which? And it's very interesting because, once again, whenever we take ancient texts, we come with our own cultural baggage. So if we're Thai, we have our reading of gender based on Thai culture. If we are Italian, we come to it with our Italian way of understanding gender and so forth. So it's a very interesting topic of conversation of, once again, doing this process of unwrapping and really clearly seeing what it is. And Rick says, I have practiced acceptance, loving kindness, and compassion with all beings and not making an issue out of LGBTQIA+. I have lived in harmony with family members and good spiritual friends who identify themselves in such ways. I felt it is none of my business as long as we're not hurting ourselves or others. Yeah, that's all very good. That's exactly it. Why do we care so much who and why other people are dating who they're dating, or if they're not dating anyone at all? A lot of people seem, for example, to be very concerned in the States when I tell them that I'm celibate. I'm a celibate monastic, and that we, as monastics, we don't have family. People get very concerned sometimes, and they're like, "Oh, that's not possible. That it's against nature. That shouldn't be done. This and that." I'm like, "Yeah, nobody's telling you to do it. You can have all the sex that you want. It's completely okay." So it's very interesting how then we can be the ones who are way too concerned about what other people are doing, how they're going about the world. So as long as they're not harming anyone and they're not harming themselves, it's completely okay. And Chittapala says, as a trans Buddhist, I have had 15 years of some teachers using teaching of Anatta to discriminate against trans folks. This inspired the book Transcending Trans Buddhist Voices to be Born. Oh, thank you so much, Chittapala, for sharing that book. I'm so sorry that you had to go through 15 years of that. That is very, very, it's very sorry. So that's why I'm very happy that actually Bhante Kaliko has been doing all the work that he's been doing. I didn't even know that it was such a big problem in Buddhist circles. Once again, because of the focus that we have here at Empty Cloud on early Buddhist teachings, and it's a non-problem, as we were mentioning earlier. So sometimes when we are in our little bubble, in our little Empty Cloud bubble, we can forget that the experience of others can be very different. And Chittapala says, you're totally correct when you said we need to totally accept our gender before we can let it go and really dive into the teaching of Anatta. Absolutely. This can also, this applies for every single one of us. It is extremely important with anything. I mean, all of the teachings of the Buddha are about investigating the mind. The Sabbasava Sutta is also a way, a very powerful sutta where the Buddha encourages us to not take one size fits all to address, all the different influences that we have, but rather to understand, to clearly discriminate when it's the appropriate time to what is the appropriate tool essentially to use in order to transcend the asavas. So sometimes he says, okay, these asavas need to be transcended by seeing. Sometimes instead, they need to be transcended by using. Or in this other occasion, we have to endure the situation. Or in other situations, we have to avoid it altogether. So this is extremely important because we tend to think, okay, well, I'm going to endure everything. So in the case that actually you were talking about of 15 years of discrimination, essentially, that is what it is. Then we think, okay, as good Buddhists, we have to endure this. We have to endure all of this stuff. No, actually, I think that in that case, we should avoid it altogether. That's those those thoughts can be very harmful. Those ideas can be very harmful. And so we always need to evaluate the effects that they have on the mind. Do we feel more empowered in practicing the Dhamma? Or do we feel more debilitated to practice the Dhamma? Is suffering increasing or decreasing? So when there's discrimination happening, when there is lots of things that make us feel unsure about our abilities, well, in my dictionary, that needs to be avoided altogether. So we need to go somewhere else, or we need to create different conditions. Definitely, that's been my approach. And Rick says, in rural Indiana, many people are prejudiced and hostile toward LGBTQIA plus people. Most are fundamentalist Christians and use their beliefs to harm and control others. Could you talk about the issues of people using their religious beliefs to harm and control others? Thank you, Rick, for asking that. Yes, unfortunately, it's that seems to be a prevalent thing worldwide. It is actually something that touches my heart a lot, especially seeing the. I was reading this article on the New York Times recently about 1 year after the Taliban occupation in Afghanistan, and to see all of these women in Kabul who overnight had all their rights removed. And the pretext is this religious ideology. So of the Taliban's, which essentially creates a miserable state of being for these women, and also a miserable state of being for the whole country, for the entire country, that all of a sudden has half of the people incapable of working, for example, removed by the workforce. The poverty of the country has doubled in a year. It's just so insane. So yeah, it's quite problematic when we try to essentially use religious beliefs to harm and control others. So I don't know what to say except to highlight that is not the way, that it's completely against the Dhamma, and it has incredible repercussions and bad vipaka on whoever is committing those acts. And that is why it's important as Buddhist practitioners that, on the other hand, we are empowered by the Dhamma. We have the Dhamma available to us. It's important to investigate the mind and to see, not to do the same things that otherwise our tendencies of mind, kind of our defilements of mind, push us to do. Basically taking on these views: only this is true, everything else is wrong. Only this is true, everything else is wrong. You people should be doing this, and you people shouldn't be doing that. But rather, I think we addressed that in our Sangha panel on faith and doubt. Always nourishing that mind of doubt, which is not a skeptical doubt, but it's a doubt that is more about investigation of the teachings. So really highlighting what are the dogmas that we hold inside of our mind, and how can we deconstruct them? How can we let them go? So unfortunately, we can't control other people's actions, but fortunately, we can control our actions. We can control our thoughts. We can control our ways of, yeah, of acting through body, speech, and mind. So that's what the Dhamma empowers us to us, and that's what we should be focusing on. And Steve says, I think a lot of problems arise from current trans activism and their gender ideology, changing sex with drugs and surgery for minors, and the sexualization of children as young as 5 in Western schools, especially in the USA, but also in UK and Canada. What are your thoughts here? Not sure I know what you mean, what you're referring to. So gender ideology, changing sex with drugs and surgery for minors. I mean, for the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, actually at the age of 13, we can become bhikkhunis. So I think, there is a sort of idea in the West that at the age of 18, we're completely incompetent of deciding main things. So when it comes to gender identification, I mean, we have to also be quite clear that the majority of people in the world identify with the gender that has been assigned to them at birth. The majority of people are heterosexual, mostly. So would be really, really convenient for everyone to be heterosexual and to be okay with their gender assigned at birth. Do you know how inconvenient it is in the majority of the world to be different? I mean, if you just remember being an adolescent in high school, I think 99% of people had a terrible high school experience, right? They were different in one shape or form, and they wanted to fit in. So hardly anyone, from my experience, under the age of 18 is really trying to be different just for the sake of being different, and definitely going through altering medical procedures for the sake of proving a point. But rather, that's why it's called all of these procedures. Bear in mind that I don't read the news really that often, very rarely, but I think the proper name is gender affirming procedures. So gender affirming, we're affirming our gender. So it's a way through essentially get to a stage where one is comfortable with themselves, where one is taking a big sort of massive dukkha away. Even though they're taking up also big, massive dukkha, which is dealing with all the other people that tell them not to do that. But clearly that huge, massive dukkha of everyone else telling you that you're doing something that is incorrect, like not proper, etc., etc. Apparently, it's less than the big dukkha of pretending to be someone else. I really like how, in general, not related to these topics, but in general, how Bhante Sujato phrases it, that Buddhism starts when psychology ends. So we want to be, our aim is to get to a sort of psychological state of well-being, where we're okay somewhat with how we are psychologically and physically. So that then that empowers us to really use properly the instruments that the Buddha gives us. It's no different than, we get very fixated with gender identity, but I mean, what about if our leg breaks? We don't just go, okay, well, I'll just be be okay with not having a leg or my leg decomposing. No, we actually put causes and conditions in order to heal the leg, so that the leg can be capable of supporting our spiritual practice, for example, if we're Buddhists, right? So it's no different. Essentially, if we have a gender that has been assigned to us at birth that doesn't fit quite right, is no different to me than a body part that is not quite right. So we want to fix that so that it enables it helps us to practice. And then of course one can practice without a leg Buddhism, but it's much easier if you have both legs to do walking meditation. Yeah.
Was there a second part of that question when they were talking about in the school system?
The sexualization of children as young as 5 in Western schools. I don't understand what that is.
I can only speak, I worked in the school system over 20 years. And all I can say is that was never, I never heard any conversation, multiple schools, multiple grades. That was never a conversation. That was never something that teachers brought up, parents brought up. It was questions like, why can't those kids read, or why is this happening? There's concerns about education. Nothing like that, ever did I hear any conversation throughout my career.
Steve,
never.
Samanera Mettico, who has been, before entering, before going forth in Buddhism as a monastic, he's sharing that he was in the school system and he has never heard anything about anything about that.
Like anything near that.
Oh wow!
It's not something that happens in schools.
Thank you for highlighting that. And Vero says, Ayya, this is a wonderful topic. As a psychotherapist, I see how some colleagues reject to work with not heterosexual consultants. Some colleagues reject to work with non-heterosexual. Oh, wow, that's very sad. Yeah, it can be quite problematic. And as Buddhists, we really have to always remember the practice of not harming. That's our job. One thing that I really like to always highlight for myself and others is to never invest energy in doing other people's jobs. We have enough job for ourselves. Like, our duty is to attain awakening. So we need to deal with our own dukkha. We need to deal with our own issues. We need to deal with our own identities and just not harm others. And then, if we want to bring it a step further, which is even better, help others. So none of these, in the non-harming and in helping in the list, there is not like telling them how to identify, telling them to have sex with this person or this not this other person, not to basically try to also dismantle their sense of self and so forth, and to get them enlightened when we are unenlightened. That's complete craziness. And Daniel says, I've heard that in some texts it said Pandaka not only can't ordain, but are also not allowed to make offerings to the Sangha and are incapable of enlightenment. Is this Theravadan view? First of all, Daniel, good to see you online. We just met Daniel a couple of weeks ago. And I would say that actually I'm reading this interesting book on Pandakas. And it's very interesting because it highlights the incredible craziness of definitions of what a Pandaka is, and the way that we cannot pinpoint it. In this book, there's also actually an illustration from the Tibetan canon of a Pandaka, where they actually are neither male nor female nor any, they are human being, maybe, I don't know, but without genitalia. So they only have an urethra, where to only apparently take out fluids out, not other kind of things. So they're actually probably not a human being either. I don't know. So there is a lot of range of speculation of what these Pandakas are. So that's where it comes to My understanding is that each culture essentially takes up the word pandaka, and we're doing the same exact thing these days in the West. We take this word pandaka that we have no idea what it is, and we project onto it all sorts of definitions, which can be sometimes in certain cultures, it can be homosexuality, they're pandakas, but clearly they're not. I mean, clearly we see in the Vinaya, for example, that there's tons of monastics that are, well, maybe not tons of monastics, but there's definitely cases of monastics having homosexual intercourse. And it's just a problem in the way that it's a breach of the precepts, but not a problem in the way that it's homosexual. And definitely they're not pandakas in the Vinaya. So clearly that's not a definition that is there. Or clearly, for example, the monastics transitioning from one gender to the other, it's not a pandaka. So why are we creating these sort of definitions? I think that's the problem, that we are projecting definitions onto the word pandaka, but pandaka, nobody really quite knows what a pandaka is, and it varies so much from tradition to tradition that even to today's tradition has a different understanding of what a pandaka is. So yeah, I don't know if we should be even bothering too much with this pandaka story. But anyway, I'd love to continue having this conversation once I finish the book, because it's actually quite fascinating. Chitapala says, I finally found home at Birken Forest Monastery with Ajahn Sona. Do you think the teaching of Anatta can be taught too early? I find that can scare LGBTQIA off if they haven't accepted themselves. First of all, I'm very happy that you found a home at Birken Forest Monastery. And I would say that absolutely the teachings of Anatta cannot be taught too early. Everything has to be presented all at the same time, in my opinion, these days, because it's 2,500 years after the Buddha. And the majority of teachers are not enlightened, and definitely for the most part, the ones that we're encountering are not enlightened. Hence, if they start editing the teachings for us, it can be quite problematic. That was my interest in starting Buddhist Insights, actually, with Bhante Sudazo. That's why I was drawn to monastics, was because I was finding that the majority of the teachers that were available to me back then, prior to Buddhist Insights, they were editing the teachings for me. So there was actually very little information on Anatta. There was zero information on karma and rebirth, which can actually be extremely useful concepts when we're talking about LGBTQIA plus identities, to understand how all of these identities come into being to begin with. You know, if we have a concept of YOLO, you only live once, well, we tend to think this is the norm and this is abnormal. But instead, when we go into, a different kind of more circular way of understanding how we are reborn, then we can fully understand, for example, gender dysphoria. Maybe you've had a gender for so long, and then all of a sudden you come into being with a different type of characteristics, different type of body. Well, of course, that will be dysphoria, right? And so forth. But we don't remember what has happened in the past. But when we see it in this context, completely makes sense. We also understand that each one of us has been male, female, intersex, hetero, gay, lesbian, intersex, everything. We've had LGBTQIA plus identities, including the heterosexual, each one of us. And of course, this is constantly changing in flux. So no, I would say that absolutely we should share the teachings of Anatta. They were extremely helpful for me to understand, actually for me to even become interested in Buddhism. People constantly expect us, for example, to be consistent outside of Buddhist circles. maybe also in Buddhist circles, but that's more for wrong view. But outside, definitely there's the idea, like Ayya Soma should be exactly identical to, like, I don't know, my parents have that expectation of me. Oh, when you were 10, you wanted to be, I don't know, a lawyer. And I was like, yeah, I also wanted to be a ballerina. Like, so, so there are many different things that are constantly changing. But outside, we expect for them to be attas that are never, never changing. So also when it comes to, yeah, the fluidity of gender, I feel like it's extremely Buddhist concept, to be quite frank, that has its roots in anatta. And Jeff says, isn't gender and procreation part of the samsara of the cycle of birth and death? Can we achieve enlightenment while still clinging to a gender or participating in the procreative cycle? So I think I addressed some of this already. And no, we cannot achieve enlightenment while still clinging to a gender. But of course, we're going to be clinging to a gender until we attain enlightenment. So it's just the process. We're clinging to everything. Otherwise, we wouldn't be enlightened. So the whole path is to learn how not to cling to things, including gender. But we can't expect not to be clinging to things to begin with. And Rick says, I like applying the Buddha's teaching about not extolling ourselves or disparaging others and to not cling to fixed views. In addition, I prefer to focus on my own practice and delight in the uniqueness of each being. Thank you for sharing that. And James says, Dear Ayya Soma, I was present at a novice ordination ceremony, and I'm puzzled by one of the questions of the aspiring ordinees that relates to the ordinee biological sexual identity. I understand the importance of rising above desire, particularly sexual desire for monastics. However, is there a practical reason why a person with both male and female sex organs would not be able to take the monastic vows? Oh, the question's been addressed already. Yep, that's what I was about to say. Thank you. Naranjan asks, as there is no self, then why do we feel the self? Because of ignorance. It's a strong habit. We tend to see it's what actually the Buddha talks about, vipallasa. So the distortions of mind. We tend to see what is impermanent as permanent. We tend to see what is suffering as non-suffering, as pleasant. And we tend to take what is impersonal as personal. So it's just a distortion of mind. And through the practice of Dhamma, we try to correct it. And so it says, Dear Ayya, any discussion on gender seems to be a discussion on how beings just keep suffering one way or another since they cling to one thing or another while they can't avoid death over time. Is this in line with a view that Buddha would support, or is it just wrong to think this way? Let me read again. Any discussion on gender seems to be a discussion on how beings just keep suffering one way or another since they cling to one thing or another while they can't avoid death over time. I mean, any discussion on any topic of Buddhism is pretty much that. Yes, it's about how we bond to every single thing. And gender is just one of, I think, the ones that we question the least, which is why we are triggered so much by it. We tend to really, really, really believe that there is such a thing as gender. It doesn't matter whether we are like the most woke or the least woke, the most conservative or the most progressive, and anything in between. There's the underlying tendency to believe I am X, Y, and Z. And usually I am female, or I am male, or I am whatever you want. That is very much embedded in our reality of experience. So I would say that I think that the conversations on gender really trigger a lot of discomfort because usually they're brought up by people that don't conform with the gender that, once again, is assigned at birth, that nobody, questions. And hence the people who usually don't question their biases of being male or female get really triggered because there's a conversation on something that it's that we assume that we have already transcended, maybe in our Buddhist practice if we're Buddhist, but we actually have not transcended. We haven't even contemplated what the hell it is. We just think that it's part of who we are, that it's something real, that it's, and in the meanwhile, we keep on clinging to it and reinforcing it and highlighting it. So I think it's extremely healthy. Actually, once again, we should have more and more transgender people talking about these issues. So every single person, every single Buddhist can start questioning their understanding of their own gender identity, of their own even sexual preference, sexual orientations. Sorry. Yeah, all of that. Question it. Chitabala says, thank you, Ayya, for your perspective. So many lay teachers save Anatta for advanced classes and turn away beginners. I like your view much better, but it makes me sad when queer and trans folks leave the path. Absolutely, which is why we need to have more conversations on the subject matter and clear out the wrong view. And all right, it seems that there's more questions, but we're just out of time. So maybe we can have all of these, I'll bring them up for monk chat tonight, so we can also get some perspectives from the other monastics. So thank you so much today for joining us for this live stream. This evening we will have monk chat at 7:30 p.m. New York City time, and you can come and ask all of your questions on gender and anything else that is related to Buddha Dhamma and Sangha. And if you're around in the around Empty Cloud this weekend, you're welcome to come and visit the monastery and join our all our classes that you can find on the website. All right, so may you be well and happy, and may all good things come to you. We can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.